By sunrise, the prairie was silent. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that comes after something terrible has passed through and taken everything light with it. Houses that had gone up in weeks were gone in a single night. Walls scattered like playing cards, roofs torn loose and carried half a mile downwind, nails still clinging to boards that no longer knew what they belonged to. And in the middle of that wreckage, one house still stood. No lumber siding, no neat rows of nails, no speed-built framing. Just thick walls, dark with earth, standing exactly where they had been the day before. Everyone had laughed at that house, laughed at the man who built it, laughed at the mud on his hands and the months he spent shaping dirt while others hammered and moved on. But when the wind came for real, it didn't laugh back. Out here, storms don't care how modern you are. They only test what you built and how honestly you built it. And this story is about the man who understood that before the sky turned green. Part 1, the man who didn't build like the others. Northern Nebraska, early 1880s. Back then, when the railroad pushed west, it brought more than people. It brought lumber, nails, and a new way of thinking about shelter. Build fast, build light, build now. Most settlers followed that rule without question. Balloon frame houses rose across the prairie in a matter of weeks. Fresh pine boards, cut back east, nailed together in straight lines that looked like progress. But at the far edge of one claim, a man named Elias Koenig was doing something that didn't look like progress at all. He was digging, not to plant crops, not to sink fence posts. He was digging earth to build with it. Along a shallow ravine, where the soil broke clean and heavy in the hand, Elias shoveled clay into wooden troughs, mixing it with chopped prairie grass and water until it held together like dough. He pressed the mixture into thick wooden forms, stacking the blocks under canvas to dry. No saws screaming, no hammers ringing. Just the sound of earth being shaped slowly. People noticed. They rode past and shook their heads. Some laughed outright. Others offered advice he didn't ask for. They told him dirt walls cracked. That rain would wash them away. That a real American house needed lumber and nails. One man joked that Elias was building himself a grave instead of a home. Elias didn't argue, he didn't explain, he just kept working. While his neighbors finished their houses and turned their attention to planting, Elias and his wife slept in a lean-to cut into the hillside. Winter came and went, spring followed. Still, he stacked wall after wall, each one nearly 2 feet thick. From the outside, it looked like stubbornness. Part 2, why some men build slow on purpose. I'll tell you something now that might surprise you. Back then, I didn't side with Elias either. Like most men on the frontier, I believed speed meant survival. A house was a tool, not a monument. Get it up, get inside, move on. That thinking feels practical, until you live long enough to watch it fail. Elias had already watched buildings fail. He grew up in Moravia, where floods came without warning and fires moved faster than men could run. His father taught him early that light buildings don't forgive mistakes. Anything that depends on nails, friction, or thin connections eventually loosens. And when it does, the weather finds it. Earth, when it's packed thick and kept dry, plays by different rules. It doesn't flex, it doesn't rattle, it doesn't argue with wind. It absorbs force instead of fighting it. Elias didn't choose his land for timber or convenience. He chose it for soil. Dense clay that cracked clean when dry and hardened like stone when packed and protected. He wasn't trying to keep weather out, he was trying to make it tired. That's a lesson most people never learn. Because most things don't collapse during the storm, they collapse long before it, quietly, invisibly, when we choose speed over understanding and lightness over strength. Elias understood something the rest of us didn't yet. On the prairie, the question isn't how fast you can build. It's whether what you build will still be standing when the land decides to test you. Part 3, the material everyone dismissed what most people saw when they looked at Elias's walls was dirt. That was the mistake. Out here, we're taught early to judge materials by how clean they look. Straight boards, shiny nails, fresh-cut lumber that smells like progress. Dirt looks poor, mud looks temporary. Earth feels like something you're supposed to escape from, not live inside. But Elias understood something older than railroads and catalogs. Earth isn't weak, it's only patient. The clay he used wasn't random soil scraped from the surface. He tested it the way old builders always had, rolling it between his fingers, wetting it, letting it dry in the sun, breaking it apart to see how it failed. Sandy soil crumbled, organic soil rotted, but the dense clay from the ravine held together, cracked clean and hardened with time. Mixed with chopped prairie grass, the walls didn't just dry, they locked together. The fibers controlled shrinkage, stopped cracking, and gave the mass cohesion. What looked like dirt was actually a composite, stronger than most people understood. Those walls weren't thin. They weren't decorative. They were heavy on purpose. Nearly 2 feet thick, they didn't rely on air gaps or cavities to slow heat. They relied on mass. During the day, they absorbed warmth slowly. At night, they released it just as slowly. In summer, they resisted heat the same way, staying cool long after the sun had turned wooden houses into ovens. And there were no hollow spaces for wind to work its way into, no seams to whistle, no framing to twist. Most people try to keep the weather out. Elias built something that didn't care if the weather showed up. That's the difference between insulation and inertia. One delays, the other endures. Part 4, the price of building slow building that way came with a cost. While other families settled into finished homes, Elias and his wife lived through another season in temporary shelter. There were nights the wind cut through the canvas so hard, it felt like the prairie itself was trying to pry them loose. There were mornings when frost coated everything they owned. Food was tighter. Time was scarcer. Every day spent shaping earth was a day not spent planting more acreage, not spent earning cash, not spent catching up with neighbors who had already made it. And the pressure wasn't just physical. Men rode past and asked, not unkindly, when he planned to finish. Others shook their heads and said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. There were whispers that he was risking his family for an idea that belonged in the past. I heard later that there were nights Elias stood staring at those half-finished walls, wondering if they were right, wondering if he'd misjudged the land, wondering if pride was keeping him from doing what everyone else had already done. That's the part people don't like to talk about. Building slow isn't romantic when the wind is howling and your neighbors are warm. It tests more than your body. It tests your conviction. Most men don't fail because their ideas are wrong. They fail because doubt wears them down before the test ever arrives. Elias kept going anyway, not because he was fearless, but because he trusted what he understood more than what was popular. That choice wouldn't be rewarded immediately. In fact, it would look foolish right up until the moment it mattered. Part 5. The science hiding inside dirt walls. Here's where the lesson deepens, and where most modern builders still get it wrong. Wind doesn't destroy houses. Movement does. Light structures survive by flexibility, right up until flexibility becomes failure. Every gust loosens something. Every temperature swing opens a gap. Nails don't break all at once. They creep. Wood doesn't fail suddenly. It warps, dries, twists, and pulls itself apart slowly. Earth walls don't play that game. They don't flex. They don't resonate. They don't amplify vibration. When wind hits mass, the energy disperses into weight. There's no leverage, no hinge point, no place for force to build momentum. The wall doesn't move, so the storm has nothing to work with. The same principle applies to temperature. Thin walls respond quickly. They heat fast and cool fast. Thick walls resist change. They smooth out extremes. Instead of chasing comfort with constant fuel and airflow, they hold a steady line. Elias didn't have the language for thermal mass or inertia, but he understood the behavior. He built deep into the earth, anchoring his walls to something that didn't shift with frost or rain. He tied his roof loads downward, not outward, so wind couldn't get underneath and lift. What looked primitive was actually conservative engineering. He wasn't betting on the weather being kind. He was betting on physics being consistent. And physics always is. At the time, most of us still believed the real danger was inconvenience. Leaks, drafts, repairs, things you could fix later. We hadn't yet learned that the real danger on the prairie isn't discomfort. It's sudden, violent testing. The kind that doesn't give you time to adapt. And when that test came, it didn't care how quickly your house had gone up. Part 6. The first signs of failure. The trouble didn't announce itself all at once. It never does. At first, it was small things. The kind you tell yourself you'll fix later. A window that no longer sat square in its frame. A door that stuck when the air turned damp. A faint whistle at night when the wind found a seam it liked. Frame houses talk to you long before they fail. Most people just don't listen. Green lumber, hauled in fast and nailed together faster, began to dry and twist as the seasons turned. Boards shrank. Nails loosened their grip by fractions you couldn't see but could feel. Mortarless joints opened into thin mouths that breathed cold air in winter and dust in summer. Families stuffed rags into cracks, nailed extra boards over seams, told themselves this was normal settling. But Elias noticed the pattern. When storms came through, his neighbors' houses moved. Not much, just enough to feel it underfoot. Floors shivered, walls flexed, roofs creaked like old bones. The buildings were alive in a way that made sleep difficult. Elias's house stayed quiet, not silent in a comforting way, but still, as if the wind passed around it rather than through it. I remember standing inside one of those frame houses during a spring blow, listening to the nails complain, feeling the structure shift just enough to remind you that it was holding together by agreement, not certainty. Most folks treated that movement as proof the house was working. Flexible, modern. Elias treated movement as a warning. He didn't say much. He never told anyone their house was weak. But he watched the sky more closely as the season advanced, and he reinforced things most of us thought didn't matter. He was preparing. Part 7, the night no one slept, the night the land decided to test us, didn't begin with violence. It began with pressure. The air felt heavy, like it had weight. Clouds stacked low and slow, moving with purpose instead of drift. The horizon took on a sickly green tint that every plainsman eventually learns to respect. By late afternoon, the wind changed direction twice without warning. That's when animals go quiet. That's when men start pretending not to be nervous. Rain came first, driven sideways hard enough to sting exposed skin. It found every weakness in the frame houses immediately. Water crept through siding, ran along warped boards, dripped from ceilings in places no one remembered leaving unfinished. Then the wind arrived in earnest. Not gusts, sustained force. You could feel it building, pushing, leaning into structures like a hand testing a door. Houses began to answer back. Nails squealed, roofs lifted and settled again. Windows rattled in frames that no longer fit. Inside Elias's house, there was none of that. The walls didn't hum, they didn't shake. Rain struck and ran down the exterior without soaking in. Wind had no edge to catch, no seam to exploit. While others moved furniture away from leaking walls and shouted to be heard over the noise, Elias's family sat in lamplight, listening to the storm spend its energy elsewhere. I didn't understand that contrast at the time. I do now. A shelter that moves tells the storm where to push next. A shelter that refuses to move gives it nothing to work with. By midnight, the wind had grown angry, and the land hadn't finished with us yet. Part 8. When light things go first, the real destruction came fast. A sudden surge of wind caught the broad side of the first two-story frame house and twisted it just enough to break the weak connection between walls and foundation. Once that bond failed, the rest followed like a bad idea finally acted upon. Roofs peeled back, walls folded inward, entire structures came apart in seconds. Hail followed, heavy and relentless, smashing through wooden siding and shattering glass. Stones punched through roofs already weakened by lift and vibration. Inside, families huddled under tables and mattresses, listening to their homes disintegrate around them. One house lost its roof in a single piece. Another collapsed when the wall meant to brace it gave way. Nails held until they didn't. And when they failed all at once. People ran through mud and debris toward root cellars and any solid structure they could reach. Toward Elias's house. Children who had laughed at the dirt walls were pulled inside by parents who no longer cared what anything looked like. The thick earthen walls swallowed the sound of the storm, turning chaos into a distant roar. Inside, it smelled like clay and lamplight and human breath. The floor stayed dry, the walls stayed whole. When the wind finally moved on, it left a different settlement behind. By morning, what had taken weeks to build lay scattered across the prairie in pieces small enough to carry away. The things built light had gone first, exactly as they always do. Elias's house stood where it always had, not triumphant, not proud, just present. And for the first time since he started stacking earth, no one laughed. Part 9. Morning after. The silence that tells the truth. Morning came without ceremony. No birds, no laughter, just the sound of wind moving through wreckage. What had been streets were now paths through splintered lumber. Shingles lay like fallen leaves. Doors leaned against nothing. Windows opened to open air. The prairie had taken back what had been borrowed from it too lightly. People stepped out slowly, as if the land itself might still be angry. They counted heads before they counted losses. Some stood staring at places where their houses had been, trying to recognize the shape of a life they'd built only weeks earlier. Elias opened his door and said nothing. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't claim vindication. Families came anyway. They stood on his threshold, exhausted and hollow-eyed, holding children wrapped in whatever had survived the night. He let them in, one by one, until the house was full of quiet breathing and the low scrape of boots on a solid floor. Inside, nothing had changed. The walls were plumb, the roof was whole. The windows, set deep in earth, were intact. No one apologized. No one needed to. The silence said enough. When a thing you mocked becomes the only thing left, words lose their purpose. That morning taught a lesson most men only learn once. Nature doesn't argue. It demonstrates. Part 10, knowledge given, not guarded. Rebuilding didn't begin with hammers. It began with questions. Men who had never doubted nails now asked about soil. They asked how thick walls needed to be, how to keep earth dry, how to tie roofs downward instead of outward. They asked why some structures moved and others didn't. Elias answered everything. He took them to the ravine and showed them how to test clay by hand. He explained why sandy soil failed and organic soil rotted. He showed them how chopped grass controlled shrinkage and how time did half the work if you let it. He explained foundations in plain language. Dig until the earth stops moving. Build from there. Tie mass to mass. Don't trust friction where gravity will do better. The man who had been laughed at became the man people listened to, and he never charged a thing. That mattered. Knowledge kept behind a gate doesn't build communities. Knowledge shared does. Over the summer, a few men began shaping earth blocks of their own. Slowly, carefully, accepting the labor instead of resenting it. Not everyone could afford to build that way, but those who did stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in winters. The prairie noticed. When the next storms came, fewer roofs lifted, fewer walls failed. Structures still suffered, but they suffered honestly, not catastrophically. The settlement began to change, not just in appearance, but in attitude. People stopped bragging about how fast they could build. They started asking how long something would last. That shift didn't come from pride. It came from remembering the nightlight things went first. Part 11, Frontier Man's Lesson for the Modern World. I've carried that lesson with me ever since. Not just about houses, about everything worth building. Speed feels like progress because it gives quick rewards. But speed charges interest, maintenance, repairs, anxiety, eventually replacement. Heavy systems are slow to start and slow to fail. They forgive mistakes. They don't panic under pressure. Whether you're building a home, a skill, or a life, the question is the same. Are you building for convenience or for storms? Modern life is full of nail houses. Things held together just well enough for calm weather. They look fine right up until the test arrives. Then everything light is suddenly very expensive. Elias didn't reject progress. He rejected forgetting. He remembered that the land doesn't change its rules just because we've learned new shortcuts. Out here, the strongest thing isn't what goes up fastest. It's what stays put when everything else is moving. And that's frontier wisdom you can use anywhere. Long after the prairie wind has passed. Part 12. Build like the storm remembers you these days. When the wind starts to rise, I still step out onto the porch. Not because I'm worried, because I remember. I remember the sound of nails crying in the dark. I remember walls that promised shelter until they didn't. And I remember one quiet house made of earth, standing where everything else had learned the cost of being light. Time has a way of sanding down details, but it sharpens lessons. Elias Koenig didn't live forever. None of us do. But the way he built outlasted the years he was given. Long after the laughter faded, his walls kept doing their job without complaint. They didn't ask for praise. They didn't demand attention. They just stayed. That's what real strength looks like. Not speed, not convenience, not the shine of something new. Strength is choosing wait when light feels easier. Choosing patience when everyone else is rushing. Choosing to build something that doesn't need you around to keep fixing it. The frontier taught me this, and it'll teach anyone willing to listen. Nature doesn't care how clever you sound. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't forget. It tests what you build when you're not ready, and it remembers what failed last time. So whether you're raising walls, learning a skill, or putting together a life you hope will hold, ask yourself one honest question. Are you building for calm weather, or are you building for the storm that hasn't arrived yet? Because out here, storms don't announce themselves. They just show up. And when they do, only what's built with truth, weight, and patience will still be standing when morning comes. That's not old wisdom. That's survival.